What if everything you believe about God is not just incomplete but fundamentally impossible? Not unlikely, not improbable, but logically contradictory at its very foundation. You have been told that God is a being separate from the world, a creator who exists outside of creation, a personality who chooses, judges, and intervenes. You have been taught that faith requires you to accept this without question, that doubt itself is a form of betrayal. But what if the very concept you worship contains within it the seeds of its own destruction? Consider this carefully. You imagine God as a supreme being, the greatest possible entity, infinite in power, knowledge, and goodness. Yet in the same breath, you imagine God as separate from you, as distinct from the world as a thing among things, albeit the highest thing. Do you not see the contradiction? Can something truly infinite be limited by existing alongside other things? Can something truly supreme be defined by what it is not? These are not idle questions designed to provoke anger or offense. These are the necessary inquiries of a mind that refuses to accept comfort over truth. If you claim to love truth, if you claim to seek understanding, then you must be willing to follow reason wherever it leads, even when it leads you away from the beliefs that once gave you peace. Baruch Spinoza understood this better than almost anyone who ever lived. Born in 17th century Amsterdam to a family of Portuguese Jewish refugees, he was trained in the traditional teachings of his community. He studied the Torah, the Talmud, the commentaries of the great rabbis. He was intelligent, devoted, promising, and yet by the age of 23 he was expelled from his community with a curse so severe that no one was permitted to speak with him, do business with him, or come within 4 cubits of his presence. What crime had he committed? He had followed his reason to conclusions that his community could not tolerate. Spinoza did not reject God in the way that modern atheists often do. He did not say that the universe is meaningless, that existence is an accident, that we are biological machines adrift in an uncaring cosmos. His conclusion was far more radical and far more disturbing to the religious authorities of his time. He argued that God and nature are one and the same thing, that there is no separation between creator and creation, that the very idea of a personal, transcendent God is not just unproven but logically impossible. Why impossible? Because the God of traditional religion contains contradictions that reason cannot resolve. A being that is infinite yet separate, a consciousness that is perfect yet makes choices, a personality that is eternal yet responds to temporal events. These are not mysteries to be accepted on faith. These are logical impossibilities that reveal the concept itself to be incoherent. You might resist this immediately. You might feel the urge to close your mind, to protect your beliefs, to dismiss these arguments before you have even considered them. But ask yourself, if your faith is true, what do you have to fear from examination? If your God is real, should not reason lead you toward that reality rather than away from it? And if reason consistently leads you away, what does that tell you about the object of your faith? Spinoza spent his life grinding lenses for optical instruments, living in modest rooms, declining prestigious positions, and carefully, methodically working out the implications of his philosophical insights. His major work, The Ethics, was published only after his death because he knew that the world was not ready for what he had to say. Even today, more than 300 years later, most people are not ready. Most people prefer the comfort of belief to the challenge of understanding. But you are here, you are reading these words. Something in you is willing to question, to examine, to follow the argument. That willingness is the beginning of intellectual freedom. It is also the beginning of a more honest relationship with reality, one that does not require you to pretend that contradictions are mysteries or that confusion is depth. Let us begin, then, with the most fundamental question. What do you mean when you say the word God? Not what you feel, not what you hope, not what you were taught, but what you actually mean. What is the concept you hold in your mind? Until you can answer this question clearly, you cannot know whether you believe in something real or something impossible. To understand why the traditional concept of God cannot exist, we must first understand what Spinoza meant by substance. This is not a technical term designed to confuse, but a simple and necessary idea. A substance is something that exists in itself and is conceived through itself. In other words, a substance does not depend on anything else for its existence or its definition. It is self-sufficient, self-explanatory, the foundation upon which other things rest. Now, consider the implications of this definition. If a substance is truly independent, truly self-sufficient, then it cannot be limited by anything external to itself. If it were limited, there would be something outside of it that constrained it, and then it would not be truly independent. It would depend on that external thing for its boundaries, for its definition of what it is not. Follow this reasoning further. If a substance is unlimited, then it must be infinite. If it is infinite, then it must possess all possible attributes, all possible ways of being. Why? Because if it lacked any attribute, there would be something it is not, some way of being that exists outside of it, and then it would be limited. It would not be truly infinite. Here is where the traditional concept of God begins to collapse. You imagine God as a being with certain attributes: consciousness, will, goodness, power. You imagine God as having these qualities while not having others. God is not matter, you say. God is not the physical world. God is spirit, not body. God is here, not there. God is this, not that. But do you see what you have done? You have made God finite. You have limited the infinite. You have taken what you claim is the greatest possible being and reduced it to something that exists alongside other things, something that is defined as much by what it is not as by what it is. Spinoza saw this clearly. If God is truly infinite, truly unlimited, truly the greatest possible reality, then God must be the only substance that exists. There cannot be two infinite substances, because each would limit the other. There cannot be God and the world as separate things, because then God would be limited by the existence of something other than God. The conclusion is inescapable. Either God is everything that exists, or God is not truly infinite. Either God and nature are identical, or God is a finite being that you have mistakenly called infinite. This is what Spinoza meant by his famous phrase, God or nature. Not that nature is divine in some poetic sense, not that the universe is sacred or holy in the way religious people use those words, but that the terms God and nature refer to the same single reality. There is only one substance, and you can call it God or you can call it nature, but you cannot separate them into creator and creation, into supernatural and natural, into spirit and matter. Now consider what this does to the God you worship. The God of traditional religion is a person. This God thinks, chooses, judges, loves, becomes angry, shows mercy, makes plans, and responds to prayers. This God has a will that can be obeyed or disobeyed. This God enters into relationships with human beings, makes covenants, issues commandments, and intervenes in history. But what is a person? A person is a finite being with particular characteristics. A person is defined by having some qualities and not others. A person makes choices, which means selecting one possibility while rejecting others. A person responds to events, which means being affected by things external to itself. A person has desires, which means lacking something and wanting to obtain it. Can the infinite have desires? Can the unlimited make choices? Can the all-encompassing be affected by something external? The questions answer themselves. To attribute personality to the infinite is to limit the infinite. To imagine God as a conscious agent is to imagine God as a finite being among other beings, not as the absolute totality of all that exists. You might object that God's consciousness is different from human consciousness, that divine thought operates on a level beyond our understanding. But this objection does not resolve the contradiction. It merely postpones it. No matter how elevated you make the divine consciousness, as long as you conceive of it as a distinct entity that thinks and chooses, you have made it finite. You have placed it alongside other things that exist. You have defined it by contrast with what it is not. Spinoza was ruthless in following this logic. If God is the infinite substance, if God is identical with nature, then God does not have free will. Why? Because free will requires the possibility of doing otherwise, and that possibility requires limitation. A being with free will chooses one path over another, but the infinite substance cannot choose one path over another because it is all paths. It is the totality of what exists and what happens. There is no alternative for it to choose because there is nothing outside of it. This does not mean that things do not happen according to laws and patterns. It means that these laws and patterns are not the result of divine choice, but of divine necessity. God does not create the world by deciding to create it. God is the world, and the world unfolds according to the nature of the substance that it is. Everything that happens happens because the nature of reality makes it so, not because a cosmic person willed it. Consider how this transforms your understanding of existence. You have been taught to see the world as contingent, as something that could have been otherwise, as the product of divine decision. But Spinoza shows that the world is necessary, that it could not have been otherwise, because it is the expression of infinite substance unfolding according to its own nature. The laws of physics, the patterns of biology, the regularities of human behavior, these are not rules imposed from outside by a legislating deity. They are the inherent characteristics of the one substance manifesting itself in infinite modes. This is not a cold or meaningless vision of reality, though it may seem so at first. It is, in fact, a more coherent and more honest understanding than the traditional religious view. Instead of a universe created by an incomprehensible being for inscrutable purposes, you have a universe that is identical with the infinite, that participates in the divine by virtue of existing, that is sacred, not because it was made by something sacred, but because it is the sacred. But let us go deeper still, because the contradictions in the traditional concept of God extend beyond the question of personality and free will. Consider the problem of creation itself. You believe that God created the world. Before creation, there was God alone. Then God decided to create, and the world came into being. Set aside for a moment the problem of divine decision-making that we have already discussed. Focus instead on the relationship between God and creation. If God created the world, then the world is distinct from God. It is something other than God. It has its own existence, separate from the divine existence. But now you face a dilemma. Either the world's existence diminishes God in some way, or it does not. If it diminishes God, then God is no longer infinite after creation. God has given away some portion of being to the world. God is less than God was before. This is clearly unacceptable to traditional theology, so you must say that creation does not diminish God. But then where did the world come from? If God remains infinite after creation, if God has lost nothing, then the world must somehow be contained within God's infinity. But if the world is contained within God, in what sense is it separate from God? In what sense is it created rather than simply being an aspect or mode of the divine substance? The traditional doctrine tries to have it both ways. It wants God to be infinite and yet to exist alongside a created world. It wants God to be complete and yet to have produced something distinct from God. These are not mysteries, they are contradictions, and Spinoza had no patience for contradictions dressed up as profundity. There is another angle to consider. You believe that God is perfect. Perfection in traditional theology means lacking nothing, possessing all positive qualities, being complete in every way. A perfect being has no needs, no lacks, no incompleteness that requires fulfillment. But why would a perfect being create anything? Creation implies motivation. Motivation implies desire. Desire implies lack. If God created the world, there must have been a reason. Perhaps God was lonely. Perhaps God wanted to be worshipped. Perhaps God wanted to share goodness. Perhaps God wanted to demonstrate power. Each of these motivations attributes to God a lack of some kind. Loneliness is a lack of companionship. The desire for worship is a lack of recognition. The desire to share goodness is a lack of recipients. The desire to demonstrate power is a lack of witnesses. A perfect being, by definition, cannot have lacks. Therefore, a perfect being cannot have motivations. Therefore, a perfect being cannot create. You might say that God created out of pure generosity, out of the overflow of goodness that simply must express itself. But this too is a form of necessity, not freedom. If God's goodness must express itself, then creation is not a choice but a compulsion. And if God is compelled, then God is not free. And if God is not free, then God is determined by God's own nature. And if God is determined by God's own nature, then we are back to Spinoza's vision of necessary, not voluntary causation. The concept continues to crumble the more you examine it. Consider the problem of evil, which has troubled believers for thousands of years. If God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good, why does evil exist? Why do children suffer from painful diseases? Why do natural disasters kill innocent people? Why does injustice so often triumph over justice? Traditional theology offers various responses to this problem, none of which are satisfactory upon reflection. Some say that evil is necessary for the greater good, that suffering produces growth, that without darkness we could not appreciate light. But this makes God a utilitarian who sacrifices individuals for aggregate outcomes. It also raises the question of why an all-powerful God could not achieve the same good without the accompanying evil. Others say that evil results from human free will, that God gave us the ability to choose and we chose wrongly. But this does not explain natural evil, the suffering caused by earthquakes and diseases and genetic disorders. It also does not explain why an all-knowing God would create beings that God knew would choose evil. If you know in advance that your creation will result in suffering, and you create anyway, are you not responsible for that suffering? Still others say that we cannot understand God's reasons, that divine wisdom exceeds human comprehension, that we must trust in a larger plan we cannot see. But this is not an answer. It is an admission that there is no answer. It is a way of maintaining belief in the face of contradiction by refusing to think about the contradiction. Spinoza's view dissolves the problem entirely, not by solving it, but by showing that it rests on false assumptions. If God is not a personal being with intentions and choices, then there is no divine plan to be questioned. If God is identical with nature, then what we call evil is simply part of the necessary unfolding of reality. It is not punishment, not test, not mystery. It is what happens when the infinite substance expresses itself through finite modes that interact according to natural laws. This may seem harsh. It may seem to remove meaning from suffering, but consider the alternative. The traditional view tells you that your suffering is part of God's plan, that it serves a purpose you cannot understand, that you must trust in divine wisdom even when that wisdom seems indistinguishable from cruelty. Is this comforting? Does it bring you peace? Or does it simply add confusion to pain? Spinoza's view tells you that suffering is real, that it follows from natural causes, that understanding those causes gives you power to prevent or alleviate suffering where possible. It does not promise that everything will work out for the best. It does not tell you that your pain has cosmic significance. It tells you the truth, that you are part of nature, that nature operates according to its own laws, and that your task is to understand those laws well enough to live as wisely as possible within them. Consider, too, the question of prayer. Billions of people pray every day asking God for health, for success, for guidance, for the safety of loved ones. They believe that their prayers can influence divine action, that God hears and responds, that faith can move mountains. But what would it mean for the infinite to respond to the requests of the finite? What would it mean for the eternal to be moved by the concerns of the temporal? If God is truly infinite, truly eternal, truly absolute, then God cannot be affected by anything external, because there is nothing external to God. If God and nature are one, then prayer is simply one part of nature addressing another part of nature. It may have psychological benefits for the person praying, but it cannot alter the necessary unfolding of reality. This is not a denial of spirituality. It is a clarification of what spirituality can honestly mean. You can still feel awe at the vastness of existence. You can still experience connection with something larger than yourself. You can still find peace in contemplating the infinite. But you do this knowing that you are not petitioning a cosmic person. You are recognizing your place within the whole. You are aligning your understanding with the nature of reality. You are, in Spinoza's phrase, seeing things under the aspect of eternity. Let us examine one more dimension of the traditional concept, God's relationship with morality. You believe that God is the source of moral law, that right and wrong are determined by divine command, that your ethical obligations come from God's will. But Socrates asked the crucial question more than 2,000 years ago. Is something good because God commands it, or does God command it because it is good? This dilemma has never been satisfactorily resolved by traditional theology. If something is good simply because God commands it, then morality is arbitrary. If God commanded you to torture children, would that become good? If God commanded you to betray your friends, would that become right? Most believers recoil from this conclusion. They sense that certain things would be wrong regardless of what any being commanded. But if God commands things because they are good, then goodness exists independently of God. There is a standard outside of God to which even God conforms. This means that God is not the source of morality, but rather a being who recognizes and transmits a morality that exists apart from God. This significantly diminishes God's role and raises the question of what this independent morality actually is. Spinoza cuts through this dilemma with characteristic clarity. Morality is not about obeying commands from a cosmic legislator. Morality is about understanding what genuinely benefits human flourishing and acting accordingly. What is good for a human being is what allows that being to persist in existence, to increase in power and understanding, to experience more of reality. What is bad is what diminishes these capacities. This is not relativism. Spinoza was not saying that each person decides what is good for themselves. He was saying that human nature is what it is, that humans have real needs and real capacities, and that reason can determine what actions genuinely serve those needs and develop those capacities. Murder is wrong not because God commands against it, but because it destroys a human life and damages the social fabric that allows human flourishing. Honesty is right not because God values truth, but because deception undermines the trust that makes cooperation possible. This grounding of morality in reason and human nature, rather than divine command, may seem to remove the sacred dimension from ethics. But consider what it gives in return. It gives you a morality that makes sense, that can be investigated and understood, that does not require you to accept arbitrary prohibitions whose purpose you cannot fathom. It gives you ethics as a form of self-knowledge, rather than as submission to external authority. At this point, you might feel that Spinoza has taken away everything you valued in the concept of God. Where is the loving Father who watches over you? Where is the righteous judge who will make all things right? Where is the personal Savior who knows your name and cares about your struggles? These are gone. Spinoza does not pretend otherwise. The God of traditional religion cannot exist because the concept is incoherent. You cannot have a being that is both infinite and limited, both eternal and temporal, both necessary and choosing, both perfect and creating. The contradictions are not mysteries to be embraced, they are errors to be corrected. But what replaces the traditional concept is not nothing. It is not cold mechanism. It is not meaningless accident. What replaces it is the understanding that you are part of the infinite, that your existence participates in the one substance, that your mind is a mode of the infinite intellect, that your body is a mode of the infinite extension. You are not separate from the divine. You are an expression of it. This is what Spinoza called blessedness, the intellectual love of God that comes from understanding your place within the whole. It is not worship of a distant deity. It is recognition of your identity with the infinite. It is the peace that comes from seeing things as they necessarily are, rather than wishing they were otherwise. It is the freedom that comes from acting out of understanding, rather than out of obedience to incomprehensible commands. Spinoza himself embodied this way of being. Despite his excommunication, despite his poverty, despite the danger of publishing his ideas, he lived with remarkable equanimity. He did not complain about his circumstances. He did not rage against the injustice of his treatment. He accepted his life as the necessary expression of his nature within the larger necessity of existence. He found peace not through faith in a personal God, but through understanding of impersonal reality. This is the gift that Spinoza offers, though it is a gift that most people refuse. It requires you to give up comforting illusions. It requires you to face reality without the cushion of providential meaning. It requires you to find your own purpose rather than waiting for purpose to be assigned to you. Most people are not willing to pay this price. Most people prefer the comfort of incoherence to the challenge of clarity. But if you are willing, if you can follow reason wherever it leads, if you can examine your beliefs without flinching from their contradictions, then you will discover something remarkable. You will discover that truth is more satisfying than illusion, that understanding is more peaceful than faith, that facing reality honestly is more liberating than hiding behind comfortable fictions. The God you worship cannot exist because the concept contains irresolvable contradictions, but the reality that exists is far more vast, far more strange, far more worthy of contemplation than the personal deity you imagined. It is infinite substance, expressing itself in infinite ways. It is nature in its totality, operating according to its own necessity. It is what truly is, whether or not you believe in it. We have traveled far together through these arguments, and you may feel disoriented, perhaps even disturbed. The ground that once seemed solid beneath your feet has revealed itself to be constructed of contradictions and confusions. The God you thought you knew has dissolved under the acid of reason, leaving behind not emptiness, but clarity. Let us gather the threads of what we have discovered. The traditional concept of God as a personal, transcendent being who creates the world, issues commands, and responds to prayers cannot withstand rational examination. Such a being would have to be both infinite and limited, both perfect and desiring both eternal and temporal. These are not paradoxes that reveal profound truths. These are logical impossibilities that reveal conceptual confusion. Spinoza showed us that if we are to use the word God meaningfully, we must identify God with the one substance that exists, which is nature itself. God does not create the world because God is the world. God does not choose because the infinite has no alternatives. God does not respond to prayers because there is nothing external to the infinite that could affect it. God does not command morality because morality is grounded in the understanding of what genuinely benefits finite beings. This is not atheism in the usual sense. Spinoza did not deny the sacred. He relocated it. The sacred is not in a separate realm beyond the physical. The sacred is the physical understood in its infinite depth. The sacred is reality itself when seen clearly, without the distortions of wishful thinking and traditional prejudice. You might still resist this conclusion. You might feel that something essential has been lost, that meaning requires a personal God who cares, that life without divine purpose is life without any purpose. But examine this feeling carefully. Is it a rational objection, or is it emotional attachment to familiar beliefs? Is it an argument, or is it nostalgia? The meaning you seek does not require a cosmic person to validate it. Your life has significance because you are a unique expression of infinite substance, a particular mode of the one reality. Your actions matter because they affect other modes, other expressions, other beings who suffer and flourish according to natural laws. Your understanding matters because through it, the universe becomes conscious of itself. In you, nature contemplates nature. This is not a diminishment of your existence. It is an elevation. You are not a creature separate from the divine, begging for attention from an external God. You are the divine in one of its infinite expressions. You are not trying to earn your way into heaven. You are already part of the eternal. You are not hoping for future justice. You are learning to see present necessity. The fear that most people feel when encountering these ideas comes from the ego's resistance to its own contingency. You want to be special. You want your life to matter in some cosmic sense. You want your suffering to have meaning assigned by something greater than yourself. And when philosophy tells you that these desires cannot be satisfied in the way you hoped, you feel threatened. But consider what you gain when you release these attachments. You gain intellectual integrity. You no longer have to pretend that contradictions are mysteries or that faith is a virtue. You gain emotional maturity. You no longer depend on cosmic validation for your sense of worth. You gain practical wisdom. You can focus on understanding reality as it is rather than wishing it were otherwise. Most importantly, you gain freedom. Freedom from the need to believe things that do not make sense. Freedom from the guilt of doubting what you were taught. Freedom from the fear of punishment for using the mind you were given. Freedom to follow reason wherever it leads, even when it leads away from comfortable beliefs. This freedom is what Spinoza valued above all else. He lived it. He wrote during a period of intense religious conflict, when people killed each other over theological disputes. He saw the damage that dogmatic belief causes, the violence it justifies, the hatred it breeds. And he offered an alternative, the life of reason, the peace of understanding, the love of truth over the comfort of illusion. You stand now at a threshold. You can return to your previous beliefs, pretending you never encountered these arguments, pushing the contradictions back into the darkness of unexamined faith. Many people do this. It is easier. It is more comfortable. It maintains social bonds and family traditions. Or you can step forward into the light of reason, accepting that truth sometimes hurts, that understanding sometimes isolates, that clarity sometimes removes comforts you relied upon. This path is harder. It requires courage, it requires honesty. It requires the willingness to be wrong about things you thought you knew. But if you choose this second path, you will discover something remarkable. You will discover that the universe is more amazing without a creator than with one, because it exists by its own necessity. You will discover that morality is more profound when grounded in reason than when based on command, because it requires understanding rather than obedience. You will discover that your life is more meaningful as an expression of infinite substance than as a test for future reward, because it is real rather than preparatory. Spinoza died at the age of 44, probably from lung disease caused by inhaling glass dust while grinding lenses. He left behind a body of work that would influence thinkers for centuries: Goethe, Hegel, Einstein, Deleuze, and countless others. He was called by some the God-intoxicated philosopher because his identification of God with nature seemed to elevate everything to the divine level. Others called him an atheist because he denied the personal God of traditional religion. Both descriptions miss the point. Spinoza was neither theist nor atheist in the conventional sense. He was a seeker of truth who followed his reason to conclusions that did not fit into existing categories. He showed us that the question is not whether God exists, but what we mean by the word God. When we clarify that meaning, when we remove the contradictions and confusions, we are left with nature in its infinite self-expression. We are left with reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Is this enough for you? Can you find peace in understanding rather than faith? Can you find meaning in necessity rather than choice? Can you find purpose in being what you are rather than in pleasing what you imagine? These are not questions I can answer for you. They are questions you must answer for yourself honestly, without self-deception, without fear. Your answer will determine how you live, what you value, and who you become. If these ideas have disturbed you, good. Disturbance is the beginning of thought. If these ideas have confused you, that too is good. Confusion is the recognition that your previous understanding was inadequate. If these ideas have excited you, excellent. Excitement is the energy that drives inquiry forward. But do not stop here. Do not treat this as entertainment or intellectual exercise. These ideas have consequences for how you live your life, how you treat other people, how you face your own mortality. They deserve your serious consideration, your careful thought, your honest reflection. Read Spinoza yourself. Struggle with his arguments. Challenge them where you can. Accept them where you must. Engage with the great conversation of philosophy that has been ongoing for thousands of years. Your mind is capable of it. Your life deserves it. And if you find value in this way of thinking, if these reflections have opened new pathways in your understanding, then share them. Talk with others. Question together. Doubt together. Reason together. This is how human knowledge advances, not through the acceptance of authority, but through the exercise of collective intelligence. The God of traditional religion cannot exist because the concept is incoherent. But you exist. Reality exists. Understanding is possible, and that understanding, pursued with honesty and courage, leads to a form of peace that no contradictory belief system can provide. Your journey continues. The questions do not end here. They multiply, deepen, become more fascinating. Welcome to the life of reason. It is not always comfortable, but it is always worthwhile. Think for yourself. Question everything. Follow the argument wherever it leads. And remember, the first step to wisdom is the recognition that you do not know what you thought you knew. Now go, reflect, and when you return, bring your doubts, your questions, your insights. We will think together again.